Emily raised an eyebrow. Monster energy drink? Yeah, it's supposed to give you energy, right? And if he's tired, it might make him feel better. Emily, desperate and clueless, didn't question it further. She rushed to the market, gathered all the ingredients, ground melon seeds, egusi, thyme, curry, chicken, eggs, and the Monster energy drink, and hurried back home to start cooking. She had no idea what she was doing, so she threw everything into the pot at once. The melon seeds, the yams, the chicken, and then, as per Amaka's strange advice, she poured in the entire can of Monster energy drink. The pot bubbled and hissed, and Emily stood over it nervously, unsure if it was supposed to look like that. But there was no time to second guess. Dan would be home soon, and she needed to have the soup ready. When Dan finally walked through the door, tired but excited, Emily greeted him with a forced smile. "I made your favorite Egusi soup," she said, hoping he wouldn't notice her nervousness. Dan sat at the table, the bowl of soup placed before him. But the moment the soup was in front of him, he could smell something was off. His brow furrowed, but he didn't say anything. He lifted his spoon, took a bite, and immediately spat it out. What did you put in this?" he asked, his face contorted in shock. Emily, confused by his reaction, stammered, I followed a recipe. I used melon seeds, spices, chicken, and... Well, Amma said since you were tired, I should add Monster energy drink to boost your energy." Dan's eyes widened in disbelief. "You put Monster energy drink in Egusi soup?" Emily nodded, now realizing how ridiculous it sounded. Dan stood up, shaking his head. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. He was frustrated, but more than that, he was deeply disappointed. He had hoped that, after all this time, Emily might start to care about their life together, about the things that mattered to him. Feeling defeated, Dan called Emily's parents. He explained the situation, hoping they would understand and maybe convince Emily to take cooking seriously. But when her parents heard the story, they yelled at Dan instead. "How dare you make our daughter cook? She's not your servant," her father barked. "Emily is a princess. You should be thankful she even agreed to try." Dan was stunned. He hung up the phone, realizing just how deep the problem went. Emily wasn't just unwilling to cook. She believed she was above it, and her parents were encouraging this belief. Tensions between Emily and Dan grew worse after the Monster energy drink Egusi soup disaster. Dan felt humiliated, but he tried to put the incident behind him. Emily, however, was unfazed by it all. She refused to acknowledge her mistake and continued acting like nothing had happened. Her pride wouldn't allow her to admit that she had done anything wrong, and she ignored Dan's requests to take cooking classes or at least try again. In her mind, cooking was beneath her, and she had no intention of changing. The path to becoming free from cooking meant completing the 3 miles, the track, the circle, and the whole lot. Months passed, and Dan's frustration deepened. He longed for a partner who could share the responsibilities of their home, someone who would put effort into their relationship. He loved Emily, but her stubbornness and refusal to meet him halfway were starting to weigh him down. Despite this, Dan still held out hope that things could improve. One day, Dan decided to host a small gathering at their home, a chill and eat party with 3 of his closest friends. It was a casual get-together where the friends could relax, eat good food, and enjoy each other's company. The plan was simple. Each wife would cook a dish, and they would all enjoy the meal together. It would be a fun way for the wives to bond while their husbands chatted and caught up. They would conserve their energy after they had been strained by poverty. One of Dan's friends, Marcel, was the son of the newly elected governor of Rivers State. Marcel's wife, Eve, was well known for her elegance and poise, and Emily had always admired her from afar. Emily saw this as her chance to finally elevate her social status and become closer to the wives of influential people. If she could impress Eve, it might open doors for her in society. 3 of us right here. So when Dan told Emily about the Chill and Eat event, she surprisingly agreed to participate. For once, she seemed excited about something involving the kitchen. She wasn't excited to cook, of course, but the idea of being seen as a friend of the governor's wife thrilled her. And the day of the gathering arrived, and the house was abuzz with activity. Dan was hopeful that this event would bring him and Emily closer. He had gently suggested that Emily could prepare a simple dish, something she felt comfortable with. But Emily, determined to impress Eve, decided to make fish stew, a dish she had never cooked before. As the other wives arrived, they headed to the kitchen to begin preparing their meals. Eve was making jollof rice, another wife was cooking egusi, and the third was preparing a fresh salad. Emily, meanwhile, had her eyes set on chatting with Eve rather than focusing on the food. She barely paid attention to the stew, chatting away about fashion, parties, and trying to make herself seem important in front of the other wives. While the other women chopped, stirred, and cooked with care, Emily clumsily threw ingredients into the pot, not bothering to follow any recipe or pay attention to the fish she was using. She didn't bother to scale the fish or clean out its insides. She added far too much salt, a strange mix of spices, and even a handful of baking powder, believing it would somehow make the stew better. As for the scent leaves, she tossed in far too many, overpowering the stew with an intense, strange aroma. Despite her lack of focus, Emily felt confident that her dish would impress everyone. She was too busy engaging Eve in conversation, laughing and trying to seem as sophisticated as possible. When the food was finally ready, each wife proudly brought out their dish. The table was set, and the men were eager to taste the meals. Dan smiled, hoping that Emily's contribution would go well, even though he had his doubts after the Egusi soup incident. The moment everyone sat down to eat, the disaster began. Eve's jollof rice was praised, perfectly seasoned, moist, and delicious. The Egusi soup prepared by another wife was also a hit, rich and flavorful. But when it was time for Emily's fish stew, the mood shifted. Marcel, the governor's son, was the first to taste it. As soon as the spoon touched his lips, his face twisted in shock. He tried to hold back his reaction, but the look of horror was unmistakable. He quickly set his spoon down and reached for a glass of water, choking out a polite, "It's different." Dan took a spoonful, and his face instantly fell. He couldn't believe what he was tasting. The stew was an absolute disaster. It was far too salty, with an odd sweetness from the baking powder, and the overwhelming scent of the leaves made it almost inedible. To make matters worse, Emily hadn't removed the fish scales or cleaned the insides, so the stew had a gritty, unpleasant texture. The other guests tried to be polite, but one by one, they stopped eating. The awkwardness in the room grew, and Dan could feel the embarrassment rising in his chest. This wasn't just about bad cooking. It was about the fact that Emily had refused to learn, despite all the opportunities and help offered to her. Emily, realizing that no one was eating her stew, looked around the table in confusion. "Is something wrong?" she asked, genuinely unaware of how bad the situation was. One of the wives, trying to spare Emily's feelings, said, "Maybe the fish just needs more cleaning next time." But Marcel, who had grown tired of pretending, leaned back in his chair and said bluntly, "This is inedible. I'm sorry, but you can't serve this to anyone." The silence that followed was unbearable. Emily's face turned red with embarrassment. For the first time in a long time, she felt humiliated. She had always been the one looking down on others, but now she was the one being judged, and harshly. Worse still, one of the wives secretly took a picture of Emily's stew and posted it on social media. joking about the disaster. The post went viral within hours. The chill and eat was ruined. The rest of the evening was awkward and tense, and Dan was deeply embarrassed. He had begged Emily for months to take cooking classes or even learn a few basic dishes, but she had always refused. Now, her pride had led to public humiliation, and the event that was supposed to strengthen their marriage only widened the rift between them. Hence became the creation of my ongoing crisis between the two. The next day, Emily's failed fish stew was all over social media. People mocked her, calling her a spoiled woman who couldn't even cook a simple dish. Emily's friends avoided her, embarrassed by the whole incident. She couldn't go out in public without feeling ashamed, and Dan, though he tried to be supportive, couldn't hide his disappointment. Their marriage was now on shaky ground. Emily refused to cook again after the disaster, and she began acting more distant and nonchalant, as if nothing had happened. Dan, on the other hand, couldn't forget the humiliation he had faced in front of his friends, especially with the whole town talking about it. The cracks in their relationship were deepening, and neither of them knew how to fix it. After the disastrous chill and eat party, Emily's life spiraled out of control. The event had gone viral, and everywhere she turned, people were talking about her failed attempt at cooking. Social media was flooded with posts mocking her fish stew, with people calling her the monster fish lady because of the baking powder and strange mix of ingredients she used. It was a never-ending embarrassment. Emily tried to act like it didn't bother her, but inside she was crumbling. She couldn't face her friends, who had quietly distanced themselves from her. Every time she saw a post about the event, her heart sank a little more. The very thing she had always been proud of, her social standing, was now in ruins. Dan, too, was deeply affected. The tension between them grew unbearable. He had given Emily so many chances, but her refusal to change, her pride and her arrogance were pushing him away. He had thought that over time she would at least try to learn and improve, but instead she had dug her heels in even further. Dan could feel the love he had for her fading, replaced by frustration and disappointment. Emily, on the other hand, was furious with Dan. In her mind, the blame fell squarely on him. She didn't see how her refusal to take responsibility or her unwillingness to learn was the root of their problems. To Emily, Dan had embarrassed her by inviting his friends to the chill and eat party in the first place. If he had just let her be, none of this would have happened. She acted coldly toward him, dismissing his attempts to talk about the situation or fix their marriage. One day, Dan finally reached his breaking point. It had been months since the chill and eat event, and things had only gotten worse between them. They hardly spoke, and when they did, it often ended in an argument. Emily's stubbornness had left no room for reconciliation. "Emily, I can't keep doing this," Dan said one evening, his voice weary. He had just come home from work, and the house was quiet, as it had been for weeks. "We're not happy. You refuse to even try and meet me halfway. I've begged you to take cooking classes. I've asked you to help with simple things around the house, but you won't. I don't think you even care about our marriage anymore." Emily, lounging on the couch as if his words meant nothing, scoffed. "Oh, please, Dan. You're always complaining. I told you from the start, I'm not a cook. I wasn't born to serve you." "This isn't about serving me, Emily." Dan's frustration boiled over. "It's about partnership. It's about caring enough to put effort into something for the person you love. I don't care if you're not the best cook. I care that you don't even try. You don't care about this marriage, and I'm tired of pretending everything's fine when it's not." Emily rolled her eyes, refusing to engage in the conversation. "If you want someone who cooks for you like a maid, then maybe you should go marry one. Listing prices at such and such a store." China added politely that the exercise was the best thing that ever happened to her. Dan stared at her for a long moment, realizing that Emily had no intention of changing. She was too proud, too stuck in her ways. His heart sank. He had hoped things would get better, but it was clear they wouldn't. "I want a divorce," Dan finally said, his voice heavy with sadness. Emily's head snapped up. For the first time, his words seemed to hit her. "You want a divorce?" Creamy Alexander said. "Yes, Emily," he said, his voice firm. "I can't keep living like this. We're not happy, and we're not even trying to fix it. I've tried for months, but you won't listen. This marriage isn't working." He spoke gently, but with certainty, as if possessed of the magic words. Emily sat in stunned silence. She had never imagined that Dan would actually leave her. In her mind, she had always been the one in control, the one who could decide what happened in their relationship. But now, Dan was taking that control away from her. She felt her heart race with panic, but her pride wouldn't let her show it. "Fine," she said coldly. "If that's what you want, go ahead. I'll be better off without you." But deep down, Emily knew she didn't mean it. She didn't want another failed marriage, especially not after the public humiliation of her first divorce. She didn't want people to gossip about her being divorced twice. But her pride kept her from admitting that she cared, and she let Dan leave without fighting for their marriage.